Hi, boys. Welcome to another Daddy Cast. Ancient World Echoes, Week 18, a tale from ancient Greece, The Adventures of Perseus. There dwelt once in Argos a king's daughter named Danae and her infant son Perseus. Now, Acrisius, the father of Danae, had one day been terrified half out of his wits by the words of an oracle, which solemnly declared that the child of his daughter Danae should be the cause of his death. Therefore, blindly accepting the words of the oracle as true, and heeding naught but his own foolish fears, Acrisius caused Danae and her son to be seized out of the strong tower wherein he had confined them, shut fast in an iron-bound chest, and cast into the sea. Up and down on the boundless deep rocked the chest, now borne high aloft on the crest of a giant wave, now plunged headlong down into the foaming trough of the sea. Within, Danae held close her babe and prayed to be delivered. Out and out they drifted, far and far and far. At last the waters heaved them up onto the shore of an island, and the chest was entangled fast in a fisherman's net. Now the fisherman was amazed when he drew up out of the sea an iron-bound box, and found it to contain a young mother and a child of marvelous beauty. Straightway he led them to his own cottage, and commended them to the care of his wife. It then appeared that the name of the island whereupon they had been cast was Seriphus, and the fisherman was Dictys, no less a personage than brother to King Polydectes himself. In the cottage of Dictys and his good wife, Danae and her son were sheltered till Perseus grew to manhood. Then it chanced one day that Polydectes cast his eye on Danae and determined to have her for his queen. But Danae would have none of Polydectes, for he was a tyrant, both wicked and cruel. By this time Perseus was grown a youth of such strength and promise that he was well able to defend his mother, and Polydectes perceived that if he would worry the lovely Danae into becoming his bride, he must rid himself of her stalwart son. Therefore he called to him the young Perseus and said, "Youth, you have found in my kingdom an asylum and a home from the days of your infancy. Now that you are grown to manhood, it is but meet that you should repay the courtesy thus extended to you. You have reached the age when men of valor go venturing to rid the world of monsters. Go you therefore in quest of the Gorgon, Medusa, who lays waste all the surrounding countryside, and show your face no more within my kingdom until you bring me her head." Now Perseus withdrew from the presence of King Polydectes, almost in despair. He would have shrunk from no ordinary adventure possible to a hero, but the Gorgons, as he knew full well, were the most hideous monsters in the world. 3 terrible sisters they were, hateful, venomous, cruel. They had faces like women, but their bodies were those of beasts, all covered with scales of brass and iron, so hard that no sword could pierce them. Enormous were their wings, and they gleamed with sinister flash of golden feathers. They had tusks instead of teeth, and sharp, cruel, brazen claws. Their hair was writhing serpents that would curl and twist and hiss and dart out long, forked tongues to sting. Worst of all, so hard and cold and hateful was their stare, that he who looked full in their faces froze immediately into stone. Now how, mused Perseus, is a man to give battle to such horrid creatures, when he may not even look on them? Nevertheless, he bade a sad farewell to his mother, and wandered along the shore, lost in sorrowful thoughts, and longing for some wise counsel. Suddenly there glowed about him a light 7 times brighter than the sun. He looked up in amazement, and lo, there before him, resting lightly on the sand, stood a beautiful woman in long white robes, with a shining helmet on her head, a staff in her hand, and a shield on her arm, Minerva, the goddess of wisdom herself. "Perseus," said she, "take this shield. So brightly is it polished that if you keep your eyes fixed upon it, you will see the Gorgons reflected therein, and can give them battle without ever needing to look in their faces." With a mighty leaping of his heart, Perseus gave thanks, yet he said, "Though I look in the shield, where shall I, among mortals, find a sword that can pierce through their heavy scales." Even as he spoke, there came a slight rustling through the air, and hovering there on his other side appeared a youth with winged sandals and cap, in one hand a winged staff about which two serpents were twined, and in the other a crooked sword that shone like flame. "You shall use my sword," said the youth, for he was Mercury, messenger from Olympus, whence came the help of the gods to men who had deserved it. Then Minerva bade the young Perseus seek out the three gray sisters, cousins of the Gorgons, and force from them the secret of where the Gorgons' isle lay. Guided by Mercury, Perseus made off. Far to westward he journeyed, till he came to a barren, desolate shore where was everlasting twilight. Gray was the sky, and gray were the giant rocks. Gray were the straggling trunks of the leafless trees, and gray was the misty sea. As the two approached the place, there loomed up before them three old hags in flowing gray robes, with unkempt white locks hanging over their shoulders, scarce to be told from the great gray waves with crests of white that came dashing up on the shore. Perseus perceived that these three old hags possessed but one tooth and one eye among them. These they passed about from one to another, and each in turn clapped the tooth into her toothless gums and the eye into a socket in her forehead. As Perseus and Mercury groped their way cautiously toward them, it became apparent that the old hags were just at that moment quarreling over whose turn it was to have the eye. One held the brilliant, gleaming orb in her hand, and all were scolding, gesticulating, and screeching. Thus, the while they wrangled, not one of the three could see at all. "Quick," whispered Mercury to Perseus, "now is your chance. Seize the eye, and do not return it till they tell you the secret. They will never tell you otherwise." In a flash, Perseus stepped forward, nimbly seized the eye, and withdrew again to a little distance. Then there burst forth a perfect storm from the three old hags, for each thought the other had snatched the eye, but Perseus cried out boldly, "I have your eye, I, a youth from beyond the seas, nor will I return it to you until you tell me, where lies the island of the Gorgons?" The old hags begged and whined and scolded. They tried to grope their way stealthily to him, to snatch back the eye unawares, but Perseus kept well out of reach and held firm. So at last they told him that he must go still farther westward and there seek out certain nymphs who kept a pair of winged sandals, a magic pouch, and a wonderful helmet that could render its wearer invisible. These nymphs would direct him just how to reach the island of the Gorgons. At that, Perseus gave the gray women back their eye, and with Mercury journeyed once more forward. In good time they reached a beautiful glade in the forest where the sunlight filtered in blotches of gold through the leaves, and a group of graceful nymphs with wreaths and garlands of flowers disported themselves about the banks of a clear blue pool. To them Perseus presented himself and told his tale. At once they hushed their mirth and musical laughter. "We will gladly aid the hero who goes forth to conquer the Gorgon Medusa," they cried, and they tripped lightly away, brought back the winged sandals, and bound them to Perseus's feet. About his neck they hung the magic pouch, and placed on his head the helmet of darkness. When they had thus provided him, they pointed out the island of the Gorgons lying low, like a bank of dim gray clouds on the dim horizon. Now, in his winged sandals, Perseus could mount up into the air as safely as Mercury. Far, far up he soared, cleaving the air like a bird, now skimming over the checkered green earth that lay spread out far below, and now over the shining blue sea. It was midnight when Perseus at length heard a calm voice speak by his side, grave yet melodious and mild. "There below," it said, "lies the island of the Gorgons." And now it was not Mercury who spoke, but Minerva, come once more in the hour of need to give Perseus counsel. Wrapped from sight in the helmet of darkness, Perseus sank downward. The moon was flooding the earth with silver, and he saw below him a rocky coast, stone, stone, everywhere stone, shining white and cold in the cold white light. Suddenly, from among the black shadows at the base of a barren cliff, there flashed a baleful gleam, and he knew it must be a moonbeam cast back from the horrid scales on the backs of the Gorgons. Boldly he descended thither. Be cautious, Minerva said. Look into your shield. Then, in the full glowing light of the moon, he looked into his shield, and behold, a hideous sight, the three hateful sisters fast asleep, their scales and golden wings glistening, their brazen claws outspread as though ready to clutch, the snakes on their heads writhing even in sleep, and hissing now and again. Even as he looked, one of the dreadful creatures moved as though to awake. That is Medusa, said Minerva. Strike on the instant, and do not miss your first stroke. In a flash, Perseus obeyed. The Gorgon opened her freezing eyes, but Perseus, looking ever into the shield, cleaved off the head with a single stroke of his sword, seized it, snakes and all, and dropped it into the magic pouch. Well done, cried Mercury. Now fly, said Minerva, for the others are awakening. On his winged sandals, Perseus sped swiftly upward, but not a moment too soon. Medusa's sisters, awakened by the noise of his stroke, perceived what had been done and flew in a frenzy of rage to the shore, every snake on their heads a-bristle with fury. He could hear the rushing of their wings, the rattle of their brazen claws, the hissing of the serpents as they mounted up into the air in pursuit. But, thanks to the helmet of darkness, he was hidden from their sight and made off from them in safety. Perseus then bade farewell to Mercury and Minerva and set out alone to return to Seriphus. But it chanced on the way that he passed through the country of Ethiopia, which was ruled over by King Cepheus. Now there was come up at this time out of the deep a terrible sea monster that ravaged the coast of Ethiopia, a huge scaly creature with wings like a dragon and a tail like a fish. It came up and carried off oxen and people and even destroyed whole villages. The men of Ethiopia had done all in their power to rid themselves of the monster, but in vain. There was not one among them able to stand before him. Then came forward a wise old man of the people and said, Lo, our queen Cassiopeia, swelled with pride of her own beauty, did boast herself lovelier than the sea nymphs that drive their chariots with swift skimming dolphins through the waves. This frightful monster is come up out of the sea as punishment to her vanity, and never will he retire till the guilty queen offer to him her dearest treasure, even Andromeda, her daughter. Throughout all the kingdom, then, was weeping and wailing, and most of all in the palace. Nevertheless, the people must at all costs be rid of the monster, so they seized the lovely Andromeda, bound her fast with chains to a mighty rock on the shore, and left her a prey to the beast. Andromeda wrung her hands. The people stood afar off and watched, but they dared not let her free. Even Phineus, whose promised bride she was, stood by and made no offer to save her. Pale and motionless as a marble statue, save for her hair that waved in the breeze, she stood. Then, lo, up out of the sea, like a mountain he rose, the great sea monster. Andromeda shrieked. The wretched mother and father wrung their hands. Phineus shrank back, slunk away, and hid himself in fear. But there, in that moment of despair, borne up in the sky by his winged sandals, appeared the hero, Perseus. O Virgin, he cried, undeserving those chains, I am come to deliver you. With a sudden swoop, the youth darted down on the back of the monster, lighting just at the base of the neck, where the creature could not strike at him with his fangs. Into his shoulder Perseus plunged his sword. Now here, now there, he worried him, piercing first this side and then that, and darting ever out of his reach by means of his wings. With a furious splashing, the monster churned all the water about into foam. At length Perseus's wings were drenched. He dared no longer trust them. Alighting now on a rock and holding fast to a projecting fragment, as the monster floated near, he gave him his death blow. The serpent turned over on his back and floated with belly upward. The people gathered on the shore raised a shout till all the hills re-echoed. The parents, transported with joy, called Perseus their deliverer, and the hero himself released Andromeda from the rocks. Then was the lovely Andromeda promised to Perseus in marriage. Every house in the city was wreathed and hung with garlands. In the palace itself, a banquet was spread, and all was joy and festivity. But suddenly a noise was heard of warlike clamor. With a numerous party of swaggering, brawling followers, there burst into the festival hall Phineus, demanding the maiden as his own. It was in vain that Cepheus cried, "You should have claimed her when she lay bound on the rock, the monster's victim. He who neglects his claim at such a time forfeits it altogether." Phineus made no reply, but hurled his javelin at Perseus. It missed its mark and fell harmless. Then the cowardly assailant ran and took shelter behind the altar. His act was the signal for a general onset by his band upon the guests of Cepheus. Perseus and his friends defended themselves and maintained for some time the unequal conflict, but the number of assailants were far too great. Destruction seemed inevitable. Then, with a loud voice, Perseus cried, "If I have any friend here, let him turn away his eyes." And suddenly he held aloft the head of the Gorgon Medusa. "Seek not to frighten us with your jugglery," cried one of the brawlers, and raised his javelin to throw, but lo! He was turned to stone in the very act. A second was about to plunge his sword into a prostrate foe, but his arm stiffened and he could thrust not a hair's breadth forward. A third, in the midst of a taunting boast, froze with his mouth wide open. Phineus, beholding the dreadful result of his unjust aggression, felt confounded. He called aloud to his friends and got no answer. He touched them and found them stone. Then he fell on his knees before Perseus to sue for his own wretched life, but in the very attitude he too was turned into stone. Then was the marriage of Perseus and Andromeda fulfilled. King Cepheus gave Perseus a ship with stalwart rowers. He and his queen bade a fond farewell to their daughter Andromeda, and Perseus and his bride set out for Seriphus. Now it had happened that while Perseus had been away on his adventure, Polydectes had never once left off worrying Danae to force her to be his queen. His followers were as wicked as he, and in all the island was none to protect the lovely young matron save Dictys the good fisherman. At last, in his anger, the king cast Danae and Dictys both into dungeons, and there the two lay languishing when the ship of Perseus dropped anchor in the harbor. Perseus made straight for the palace. The king was at meat, surrounded by his wicked retainers. When he saw come into the hall the youth whom he had thought out of his way forever, he was sunk at first in confusion. In a moment more he cried out, "How dare you come here without the head of Medusa?" "O king," Perseus answered, "I have the head in my pouch." "Ho, ho!" mocked the king. "If you have in truth performed this unheard of act, then show us the head." "Nay," answered Perseus, "I am loath to hold it up. I tell you, I have it here in my pouch." "Ho, ho!" jeered all the king's followers. "He has it in his pouch, yet he will not produce it. Base deceiver! He but pretends to have done the deed. It is no Medusa head he has in his pouch. He dares not show us what lies there." "Come, come," called the king. "If you have there the head, out with it on the instant. Else with your own head you shall pay for the cheat." Threatening, taunting, gibing, the king's men pressed about Perseus. "As you will, then," shouted the hero, and he held it aloft, the snaky head of Medusa. In a flash about him were a white marble hall, a white marble table, with white marble food and marble statues of men. Having thus freed the island from the base tyranny of Polydectes, Perseus went to embrace his mother, set her free, and lead her to his Andromeda. Dictys likewise he freed, and made king of Seriphus in place of his worthless brother. To Minerva, Perseus returned her shield, along with the gift of the head of Medusa. To Mercury he gave back the sword. Then Perseus and Andromeda, with Danae, their mother, once more sailed away, and after many adventures Perseus found a kingdom for himself. Long and wisely he reigned, and lived happily thenceforward. The end.